Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 20th edition of Chebacco Chats. We are happy to have with us Polly McAdam, who is a College of the Atlantic student, and we reached way back into the Chebacco archives to the 2015 issue to have her talk to us about the article she wrote then called When Canopies Rivaled Cathedrals. It's the story of Mount Desert Island's elm trees. Polly, thank you for being with us and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure. And as I promised, I'm going to fumble just a little bit to get the right screen up here. But let's see what I can do. Just a moment. I know we got it here. Okay, are you looking what I hope you're looking at? Good. So, Polly, just to give a little more background about you, you're a native of Springvale, Maine, attended Sanford High School and graduated from College of the Atlantic in 2014. And with a degree in human ecology, you focused on agriculture, business, and Spanish. And today you're part of the 8th generation working at McDougall Orchards. And you plan to take it over along with your brother, sister-in-law, and husband in the future. So you've continued your work with trees.
Yes. Which
is great. And we're so happy to have you back with us again and to reacquaint yourself with this project. Just by way of background, we had a generous donor approach us 7 years ago and asked us to do a history of Mount Desert Island's elm trees. We talked to your botany professor, Dr. Nishanta Rajakaruna, Nishi for short, and he connected us to you, and you wrote this article, which is really a wonderful piece of writing and science, a combination of science and history. And to give our listeners a flavor for what your article sounds like, would you read us a segment from it?
Sure. I have my issue right here where it was published. Okay. Nearly a quarter of a century ago, residents of Mount Desert Island woke to find their beloved island covered in a layer of crystalline ice. The entire landscape glittered as the intense winter sun carved its path across the sky. For one resident of downtown Bar Harbor, the most vivid memory of that morning was Kennebec Street, lined with stately elm trees whose pendulant boughs were bent over, bowing beneath the weight of the shimmering ice so that they created a glistening silver ceiling. The tinkle of icy branches shivering against one another gave the impression of 1,000 chandeliers swaying in the frigid air. Though not always quite as magical, many streets in the United States, and especially in New England, nevertheless had an enchanting atmosphere cast over them by the once ubiquitous American elm. These trees grow with a thick, sturdy trunk and don't begin to branch until they're quite tall, at which point the slender limbs fan out through division and subdivision until many of the outermost branches point straight down. The shape of a lone elm from a distance resembles the arc of water of a whale's spout, an upside-down chandelier, or a fountain frozen in midair. As picturesque as one elm can be, when many are planted in parallel alleys that skirt a main thoroughway, the splendor only increases. The trunk and larger main branches strain heavenward, but the outer limbs seem to glance downward and take up as their main purpose the beautification of the earth. This pattern creates an avenue of vase-like figures whose edges graze those of their neighbors, forming vaulted, sun-dappled ceilings over even the humblest of streets.
I think that opening taught me so much about what otherwise is a familiar object, the elm tree, and points to a past that we only have remnants. It would be rare to find one of those tree-lined corridors today, and we'll get into the whys of that. But tell us, what is it about the elm that made it such an iconic tree in New England towns?
Sure. So ironically, one of the reasons why they became so iconic and ubiquitous is because they're unpleasant to work with and they're really hard to get rid of. They're extremely hard to cut with hand tools. They have fibers that grow knitted together rather than parallel. When they're burned as firewood, they smell awful. So they weren't really used in carpentry. They weren't used for fuel. And in the 1800s, when the goal was kind of to push back the wilderness, a lot of times elms were the only ones that were left. So they'd be outstanding majestically in the middle of fields and in towns and things. But they're also really nice to look at. They have a very pleasing shape, and they don't have low branches, which makes them really good street trees.
Right, and once you're tuned into the elm, and maybe many people are, and it was kind of a new experience to me to encounter them as you interpreted their presence on the island before I started noticing them and seeing how beautiful they are. But there's also a link between the elms and village improvement associations. Can you go into that? Tell us what that connection is.
Sure. So the first Village Improvement Association was started in the 1850s in Connecticut, and it was actually called the Elm Tree Association. In 1914, there was one that was organized in Southwest Harbor, and their first act as an organization was to purchase shade trees. At that point in time, elm trees were pretty much the ideal shade tree, so that's what they purchased to plant all around. The elm was considered, and this is one of the quotes that's in the article that I really like, it was considered the most magnificent vegetable of the temperate zone.
So there's been a significant appreciation of these trees, and you've described how it's ideal, but you describe a storm that afflicted the elm, and maybe in this time of human pandemic, we can sort of think about the elm and what it experienced, and also what you encounter in your work today in an apple orchard. So tell us about this series of diseases that affected the elm.
Sure. So the elm, one of the other reasons why it was planted everywhere, other than the fact that it wasn't super useful for anything else and that it looked really nice, was that up until the 1930s, it had proven to be relatively resilient to different pests and diseases. So by the time that Dutch elm arrived, there was basically, one main street that led all the way from all the different towns in America, or in New England anyways. So it was relatively easy for the disease to take hold. And it was made even easier by what's called the Great Hurricane, which happened in 1938. And it actually felled a lot of the large trees, which made them very susceptible, and carriers as well of the beetle that carries the fungal disease. And that's something that I was talking with you about the other day. In my life right now, I'm seeing parallels to that because at my family's apple orchard, we're battling with a fungal disease as well. And it has a lot of the same, some similar attributes in that there's nothing really chemically in terms of insecticides or fungicides that you can use. It all has to be mechanical. You have to prune out the infected wood and just kind of cross your fingers and hope that that's enough for the tree to resist.
Well, this whole subject ties into a larger environmental history because initially DDT was employed in trying to resist this disease. And how'd that work out?
It didn't work well at all. It proved to be pretty ineffective and quite expensive. And it turns out that elms, they're classified as promiscuous trees because they can exchange sap with other elms that are up to 50 feet away. And so anything chemically that you were doing in the canopy, since it's a fungal vascular disease, it can actually be transferred underground through the root systems. So it moved a lot quicker than what they could combat with insecticides. And also later they tried doing root injections. And even some trees that were treated with fungicidal root injections later actually succumbed to the disease and had to be taken down.
So there was a very energetic effort to try to control these trees. And I knew you drew on the records of John Dreyer, the Southwest Harbor tree warden. So there was a whole infrastructure devoted to managing these trees and monitoring them. So in fact, I think Mr. Dreyer had a background as a Foreign Service official. He said that nothing in the Foreign Service had prepared him for the difficult politics of being the tree warden in Southwest Harbor. Well, there's another aspect of the elms, not only as an object of beauty, as a example of environmental afflictions, but also it became ceremonial. It had ceremonial significance. Why don't you explain that to us?
Sure. Well, I think that probably came from the fact that they were really revered and often stood out. They were ubiquitous, they were beautiful. And so a lot of times saplings of elms were given as wedding gifts, and they were donated to different places to commemorate events like bicentennials. The George Washington bicentennial in 1932 was celebrated by the Southwest Harbor Village Improvement Association, actually, by donating 6 elm trees to the schoolhouses around there that could be planted. And one of the things that made them a really rewarding gift and investment is that they grow so quickly. So in one person's lifetime, they can become very, very tall and quite majestic.
Yeah, I often will ask audiences today why ceremonial elms were planted in 1932, and nobody ever knows the answer, that it marked the bicentennial of the birth of George Washington, something that everybody would have known in 1932, but almost nobody knows today, except now our audience knows.
Yeah.
And I want to invite our audience to send us questions. You can send us by commenting on Facebook Live or on Zoom via the chat or Q&A function, and we'll try to leave some time at the end to answer questions you might have about this article. So most of us have heard of Dutch elm disease. How did that take hold? And what was its effect? What did it do? We've talked about the mechanism, the hurricane of 1938 and the disease that afflicted it, but what was the effect on the larger landscape of American elms? What are we left with now?
Well, it really changed the way that small towns looked. There was kind of the ideal Yankee town that was promoted by one of the first Village Improvement Association, and that was elm-lined streets. So losing a lot of these really magnificent trees that marked childhoods and events and things like that really changed the way that that small town America and small town New England towns anyways, their entire landscape.
You described the role of the bark beetle with the interesting comparison that this is a very small insect about the size of Roosevelt's ear on a 10-cent coin, capable of being picked up by wind currents and blown farther than they could ever journey under the power of their wings alone. So it was really susceptible to contagion of disease that was easily spread. Well, and here is an example of one of the elms that's a little worse for wear, and I'm sad to say it's actually the elm at the corner of Oak Hill Road and Main Street in Soamesville. It's the one that's right at the corner where the Soamesville Museums and Gardens is located. We've had Tom Savage and his tree service company trim this tree because this winter we had large limbs falling into the parking area, and we considered cutting it down, but he encouraged us to try to get a little more life out of it. There was a very particular response on Mount Desert Island to the attack of the various ailments that elms are subject to. So how did islanders respond to its defense?
Yeah, well, the island was spared from the first waves of the disease, but by the 70s, a lot of trees were showing symptoms. And so in 1980, the Elm Tree Fund was started, and that went until 1989. And there were a group of volunteers that were called the Tree Spotters, and they went and checked the remaining elms, ones that hadn't been taken down because of the disease. And they were checking them once a week or once every 2 weeks, sometimes twice a week. And there were notices going out to them. And one of the letters that I referenced in the article was saying that they need to be very vigilant because within 2 weeks of showing symptoms, which actually is a parallel to life right now, I suppose, within 2 weeks of showing symptoms, it may be too late for that tree.
And how about up to today? Is there some kind of system for identifying and monitoring the elms, or up to the date of your study?
Yeah, so there's a lot of really, most of the large street trees in the downtown areas have town tags on them. And that's part of what the tree warden looks at, and they consistently go and check on them, take limbs off that need to be taken down. At the time that I was doing the article, which is a while ago now, the tree warden at the time had said that in his 6 years, he'd never seen evidence of Dutch elm. So at that point, it had been about a decade since they'd seen really any sign of it. But they're still checking on those trees, and most of the large elms have town tags on them and are cataloged.
Is it thought that the trees that remain are somehow resistant to Dutch elm disease or some of the other afflictions? Or
not that I know of.
Okay.
I think most of them, because quite a few had to be taken out, about half had of the healthier and the larger trees had to be taken out in the 70s. And because a lot of them were growing relatively close because they're on an island, I'm sure they all had their battles with it. There are some programs right now that are working on breeding resistant trees. They actually started right during the first waves of Dutch elm, but they didn't really get any good results until about the 70s, which is when the island was kind of battling with it. But interestingly, the biggest kind of the reason that resistant elms haven't really taken hold is because people aren't interested in buying them. I think because it had been so long that elms, were battling this terrible disease, and people had to see so many taken down because of it, that consumers weren't quick to purchase another elm and plant it, I think, fearing losing it again.
Too much heartbreak.
Yeah.
Let's go to the study that you undertook. You actually went about this systematically, in which you put a notice in the newspaper asking people to volunteer their elms. Can you tell us about that study and what you found?
Sure. It was really, really neat for me to be able to do this study because I had just graduated from College of the Atlantic and I felt like I knew the island pretty well, but it turns out I really didn't. And this gave me a really good way to connect with local business owners, homeowners that know a lot about the history of the island, and go explore and just look around and try and find these trees. And I, like you were saying too, once you really are looking for them, you tend to find them and they're hard to miss. So it was a really interesting interesting time for me. And it challenged me and I definitely learned a lot.
And I know you created a file, a GIS map of the locations of the elms that you studied. So tell us about, for people maybe who haven't awakened to the presence of elms and appreciated their beauty, where can one go to find these trees?
Yeah, well, the map was made with a lot of help. I don't really know how to do GIS, but this was thanks to Gordon Longworth at College of the Atlantic, without whom I would not have been able to do this. So now, or at least in 2015, hopefully not too much has changed since then, there were about 40 elms remaining on the island that were visible from the road. And there's that, if people wanted to go and see maybe remnants of what those allays looked like, they could go to Main Street in Soamesville. That has quite a few, and then the moorings, and I don't remember the name of the other. I think there's a hotel that you may know.
The moorings?
Yep. The
Moorings
mooring
Hotel.
and
yeah, it's in Manset, south of Southwest Harbor.
yep.
And in fact, we have a picture of it here, before and after. And as one you can see is a Ballard photo of 1938, and one taken that you took at the time of your study. And in fact, there's one that I took yesterday of the elm today. The timing of your study was that all your pictures are winter pictures. And I thought we should have one that's how beautiful it is in summer. It's really a magnificent tree. So tell us, how are they doing today? What remains of them on the island, and what is their status? Or are they doing okay? Or
Yeah, well, the ones that are left, at the time of the article, they seem to be doing well. And the tree fund that gets money annually to take care of those large street trees is still in charge of checking up on them. So it seems like, for the past 20 years or so, it's been relatively stable.
well, I want to ask you to kind of sum up and give us a sense of the larger context of elms. One of the things we try to do with Chebacco articles is point to something that's intensely local to here, but also has a larger implications for the world, for history, for the environment. Can you kind of tell us what is the importance of the elm now?
Well, I think it's a lesson that we learn, that we keep learning, and maybe are not learning enough from. And it's the idea of having a monoculture of something, that at some point it can't be stable if you're having one species planted in large swaths around things that seem incredibly resistant to everything at the time. And we're seeing this year, of course. There's always new challenges, new diseases, that are coming in. And so really strength is in diversity. Yeah.
Well, I want to invite our audience to tell us what questions you might have, or what sort of comments you have on elms you've had in your life, things elms you remember. What if you, especially if you've been around a while, do you remember back in those days when elms were so abundant in corridors on New England streets? Please chip in. And meanwhile, Polly, tell us about your work now. Give us this. I think I'm not quite sure how old you are, but maybe a quarter of your life has passed since you wrote this article. So give us an update on what you're doing now, what you've done with your education at College of the Atlantic and your pursuit of your interest in trees, and just give us an update.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely using what I learned about agriculture and business working at my family's orchard. Both of those things are extremely important, and I'm constantly learning new things, and we're facing new challenges, again, especially this year, lots of new things going on. So my family's orchard, we grow about 40 different kinds of apples. We have peaches, plums, pears, nectarines, fall raspberries, and winter squash and pumpkins. And we're constantly trying to diversify, which is one of the lessons that I was talking about, not only in what we grow, but what we offer in terms of services, having different activities that people can come and experience outside. And we're still kind of waiting to see what this year will bring us, because it's a little early for people to start thinking about apples. But when they do, we'll see what kind of response we get from folks. So we're hoping that everyone's excited to be outside.
And you are the 8th generation to be engaged in McDougall Orchard. So give us a little bit of that background. What does that mean? What does that mean to you? Give us a recount.
Yeah, sure. Okay, quickly. Well, it was the Hanson family farm for the first 5 generations. And it was passed down from one brother to a nephew, to then his brother. And they were all kind of gentleman farmers at the beginning. One was a judge, one was a lawyer. And then towards the end, they had a dairy on the ridge where we are. They had 3 floors of chickens at one time. They had horses. They always had a couple apple trees, because old farms always did. And then my great-grandfather, who was the first McDougall to be there, he married one of the Hanson girls, and he was from New Mexico at the time. So he came up, took over the farm, and decided there was a lot of money in apples. And so he planted 400 trees for each of his 4 kids, and that started the first orchard. And some of the trees, they were planted in 1932, actually, so relevant to the timeline of this article as well. We have about 40 of them that are still at the center of one of our orchards.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Wow. So we have a question from Nancy. She asks, are the bright yellow leaves in the fall in Southwest Harbor leaves of the elm?
They could be. Elms do, they are yellow in the fall. They are yellow, but I think on the slideshow, you had a diagram of an elm leaf. Yeah. And that's the best way to tell, is because they're asymmetrical at the base. So I would say look at the leaf shape rather than the color to definitely know if that's an elm.
Very good. Well, Polly, the half hour always goes by in a hurry. It's been great talking to you again and to revisit this wonderful article. Thanks very much for being part of the program.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was a great walk down memory lane.
And next week on Chebacco Chats, we have Catherine Schmidt. She is going to talk to us about searching for Spellman's birds. This is a story of history and a detective hunt. She knew from the Champlain logbooks, the young men who came up here in the 1880s to research Mount Desert Island's environment. She knew that they had collected specimens, and she found out where they were located. And how she did that is going to be the topic of next week's Chebacco Chat, also wonderfully illustrated with photographs by Jennifer Steen-Boer. So don't miss that next Thursday at 4:30. So thank you all for joining us. Polly, thank you for being with us. It's great seeing you. Bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye.